September 1948. Harlem was breathing slow that night, like it knew something was about to happen. Inside a small restaurant on 135th Street, plates clinked, cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air, and the jukebox played soft jazz that barely covered the sound of quiet conversations. It looked like any other evening, but power doesn't always announce itself with gunshots. Sometimes it walks into the front door and waits. Everyone in Harlem knew one rule. You don't disrespect Bumpy Johnson. Not in public, not in private, and never in his own restaurant. Bumpy wasn't just a gangster. He was a man who kept order in a city that tried every day to tear itself apart. Politicians feared him. Criminals negotiated with him. And the people of Harlem trusted him. That trust was his real weapon. That night, Bumpy sat in his usual booth, calm and focused, eating dinner with his wife. No bodyguards hovering. No show of force. He didn't need it. When you rule through respect, protection follows you everywhere. The restaurant was neutral ground, a rare place where grudges stayed outside and violence wasn't welcome. Everyone inside understood that peace existed only because Bumpy allowed it to. Then the door opened. 6 men walked in, dressed sharp, moving with confidence, each one armed. Leading them was a mob enforcer sent straight from the Italian Mafia. He wasn't there to eat. He wasn't there to talk business politely. He was there to send a
distant
message.
Tonight.
Harlem had something the Mafia wanted.
You can tell me.
And they were tired of asking. The room changed instantly. Conversation stopped. Forks paused midair. People felt it in their chests before they understood it in their heads. This wasn't a friendly visit. This was pressure. This was a challenge. The mobster walked straight to Bumpy's table without asking. He spoke loudly, making sure everyone heard. He talked about control, about money, about how Harlem's numbers racket should belong to the Mafia. His tone was negotiation. It was ownership, like Harlem was already theirs, and Bumpy just hadn't accepted it yet. Bumpy didn't look up. He kept eating. Slow, precise, like the man standing over him didn't exist. That's when the mobster crossed the line. He used a word you never use in Harlem. A word meant to humiliate, to provoke, to strip a man of his dignity in front of his wife and his people. The word hit the room harder than a gunshot. You could feel fear move from table to table like a wave. Everyone expected violence. They expected Bumpy to explode, to reach for steel, to turn that restaurant into a crime scene. That's what the Mafia wanted. Blood would justify war. Blood would give them an excuse to take Harlem by force. But Bumpy Johnson didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He didn't threaten. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that makes your stomach drop, the kind that tells you the game is already over and you just don't know it yet. Slowly, Bumpy placed his napkin on the table and stood up. The room felt smaller. The air felt tighter. The 6 armed men suddenly realized they weren't surrounded by strangers. They were surrounded by people who belonged to Bumpy. What happened next wasn't loud. There was no punch thrown, no gun fired, just 6 simple words spoken calmly, without anger. Those words would spread through New York's underworld like wildfire. Those words would force the Mafia into emergency meetings. Those words would make powerful men rethink everything they believed about Harlem. And as the mobster stood there, realizing he may have walked into the biggest mistake of his life, one question hung in the air. What did Bumpy Johnson say that night? And why did the Mafia never come back? Before anyone in that room could understand what those 6 words truly meant, you have to understand the world Bumpy Johnson lived in and the city that made him dangerous. Harlem in the late 1940s wasn't just a neighborhood on a map. It was a pressure cooker. Music, politics, crime, poverty, pride, all of it collided on the same streets. Every block had eyes. Every corner had a story. And at the center of it all stood Bumpy Johnson, a man who learned early that surviving wasn't enough. You had to be respected. Bumpy didn't rise through chaos alone. Years earlier, Harlem's underground economy had been shaped by a woman most people never hear about, Stephanie St. Clair. She built the numbers game when banks wouldn't lend and jobs were closed off. To the people of Harlem, the numbers weren't gambling. They were hope. Rent money, grocery money, school shoes. When outsiders tried to take it, They didn't just threaten profits, they threatened survival. That's when Bumpy became more than muscle. He became a shield. By the time the Mafia set their eyes on Harlem again, Bumpy had turned that protection into an empire. Runners, bankers, lookouts, all answered him, not because they were scared, but because he was fair. He paid on time. He protected families. He handled problems quietly. In a world built on betrayal, Bumpy kept his word, and that made him rare. The Italian Mafia didn't understand that kind of power. To them, territory was taken, not earned. They believed guns decided ownership. Harlem challenged that belief. Every time they sent threats, nothing changed. Every time they tried pressure, Bumpy stayed still. That silence made them uneasy. The man standing in front of Bumpy that night wasn't just an enforcer. He was a test. If Bumpy folded, Harlem folded with him. If he reacted the wrong way, war would follow. And war wouldn't just be about criminals. It would spill into the streets, into homes, into lives that had nothing to do with mob politics. That's why the room felt so heavy. Everyone inside Wells' restaurant understood what was at stake, even if they couldn't explain it out loud. This wasn't just about a word that crossed the line. It was about whether Harlem belonged to its people or to outsiders who saw it as nothing more than a business opportunity. The mobster glanced around the room again, reading faces. He saw fear, yes, but not the kind he expected. It wasn't fear of him. It was fear of what would happen if Bumpy chose a different path. Because once Bumpy moved, there was no pulling it back. Bumpy stood there calmly, his presence alone quieting the room. He didn't rush to explain himself. He didn't need to. Men like him understood timing, understood that silence, when used right, could speak louder than violence ever could. Outside, Harlem went on living. Cars passed. Music played. People laughed on street corners, unaware that history was pausing inside a small restaurant on 135th Street. Inside, 6 armed men waited for a response they could either use as an excuse or fear as a warning. The mobster thought he had leverage. Guns, numbers, backing from powerful families. What he didn't realize was that Bumpy Johnson had something far more dangerous on his side. A city that believed in him. And as the seconds stretched on, the question wasn't whether someone would make the first move. It was whether the Mafia had already lost the moment they walked in. The mobster shifted his weight, trying to regain control of the moment. He had walked into that restaurant expecting fear, maybe even submission. That was how these situations usually went. A show of force, a few harsh words, and the message was delivered. But this time, nothing felt right. Bumpy Johnson wasn't reacting the way men were supposed to react when pressure was applied. From the corner booths to the back kitchen, people watched without moving. Some of them had known Bumpy since he was a teenager running errands. Others only knew him as the man who made sure their kids stayed out of trouble or their rent money wasn't stolen by outsiders. To them, this wasn't a business dispute. It was personal. One of the mobster's men glanced toward the door, measuring distance without meaning to. Another adjusted his jacket, suddenly aware of how many eyes were locked onto him. Guns felt powerful when fear filled a room. Here they felt heavy, useless, like tools that didn't belong. The mobster spoke again, trying to steady his voice. He talked about respect, about tradition, about how the Mafia had rules. He claimed Harlem would be safer under their protection, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. Everyone in that room knew what Mafia protection really meant. Higher cuts, broken promises, and blood in the streets when payments fell short. Bumpy listened without interrupting. His face gave nothing away. Inside his head, though, calculations were being made. He understood the larger game. If he pushed too hard, it could spark retaliation beyond Harlem. If he showed weakness, the pressure would never stop. The balance was fragile, and every second mattered. Across the table, his wife watched closely. She had lived this life long enough to read the signs. She knew when Bumpy was angry. She knew when he was planning. The calmness in his posture told her this moment had been coming for years, whether tonight or another night. Harlem had grown too valuable to be ignored forever. In the back of the restaurant, a dishwasher slowed his hands, listening. Near the counter, a numbers runner clenched his jaw. These weren't soldiers in uniforms.
This doesn't feel right.
But they were invested.
We have to talk about
What
it.
happened
Not
next
now,
would decide
please.
whether their world stayed intact or cracked open. Outside, word was already spreading. A lookout on the corner had seen the men walk in together. Phones weren't common, but news traveled fast in Harlem. By the time the mobster finished speaking, people a few blocks away were already watching the doors, waiting to see who walked out first. The mobster made one final push. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, reminding Bumpy of what powerful men could do when crossed. It was meant to sound like a warning. Instead, it sounded like doubt. Bumpy finally moved. Not fast, not aggressive, just enough to shift the air in the room. When a man like Bumpy moves, people notice. Conversations outside seemed to fade. Even the hum of the building felt distant. The mobster realized then that this wasn't just a meeting. It was a test of will, a test of whose version of power would survive the night. Guns versus loyalty, fear versus respect. And as Bumpy prepared to speak again, every person in that restaurant understood one thing clearly. Whatever happened next would change Harlem forever. The room felt tight now, like the walls had leaned in closer. The mobster noticed it too. He could sense that the moment was slipping away from him, even though he still had 6 armed men at his back. Power was supposed to feel loud, commanding. Instead, his authority felt thin, like it could snap at any second. Bumpy stood there without raising his voice, without making show of anything. That silence was doing more damage than shouting ever could. It forced everyone to listen. It forced everyone to wait. And waiting, in a situation like this, was terrifying. The mobster's eyes drifted again around the restaurant. He saw us all where he expected fear. These weren't random people caught in the middle of a mob dispute. These were people who believed in the man standing in front of him. That belief made them unpredictable, and unpredictability was something the Mafia hated. One of the mobster's men whispered something under his breath, barely audible. Another shifted closer, trying to look confident, but his movements betrayed him. They had walked into Harlem, thinking it was just another neighborhood. Now it felt like hostile ground. Bumpy took a slow breath. He thought about the long road that led to this moment, about protecting the numbers runners when they were kids, about keeping the police at bay when raids threatened families, about every promise he had kept when it would have been easier to walk away. This wasn't about ego. This was about drawing a line that could never be crossed again. Outside, more people gathered. They didn't know the details, only that something serious was happening inside Wells' restaurant. Men leaned against street lamps. Women paused mid-conversation. Everyone sensed history hovering close. The mobster straightened his jacket, tried to reclaim control. He reminded himself who he worked for. Powerful names, powerful families, men who had ruled New York's underworld for decades. He believed that alone should be enough to bend Bumpy Johnson. But Harlem didn't bend easily. Bumpy finally spoke again, his voice low and steady. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Every word landed exactly where it was meant to. The mobster leaned in without realizing it, drawn by the calm authority in Bumpy's tone. Even the 6 men behind him seemed to pause, as if instinct told them this was a moment to listen, not act. The air felt charged now, like a storm building without thunder. One wrong word, one wrong movement, and everything could explode. Guns were still there. Danger was still real. But so was something else. Control. Bumpy's wife watched closely, her expression unreadable. She knew whatever was said next would echo far beyond that room. It would reach the mafia bosses downtown. It would reach the streets of Harlem. It would decide whether peace survived or shattered. The mobster swallowed, his confidence slipping just enough to be noticed. He hadn't expected to feel cornered in a place where he brought the weapons. He hadn't expected a calm man with no visible protection to hold the room hostage with nothing but presence. Time stretched. Seconds felt long. No one moved. No one breathed too loud. And as Bumpy prepared to finish what he had started, everyone understood they were standing at the edge of something irreversible. The next word spoken would either light the fuse for war or end the mafia's ambitions in Harlem forever. The room felt tight now, like the walls had leaned in closer. The mobster noticed it too. He could sense that the moment was slipping away from him, even though he still had 6 armed men at his back. Power was supposed to feel loud, commanding. Instead, his authority felt thin, like it could snap at any second. Bumpy stood there without raising his voice, without making show of anything. That silence was doing more damage than shouting ever could. It forced everyone to listen. It forced everyone to wait. And waiting, in a situation like this, was terrifying. The mobster's eyes drifted again around the restaurant. He saw us all where he expected fear. These weren't random people caught in the middle of a mob dispute. These were people who believed in the man standing in front of him. That belief made them unpredictable, and unpredictability was something the Mafia hated. One of the mobster's men whispered something under his breath, barely audible. Another shifted closer, trying to look confident, but his movements betrayed him. They had walked into Harlem, thinking it was just another neighborhood. Now it felt like hostile ground. Bumpy took a slow breath. He thought about the long road that led to this moment, about protecting the numbers runners when they were kids, about keeping the police at bay when raids threatened families, about every promise he had kept when it would have been easier to walk away. This wasn't about ego. This was about drawing a line that could never be crossed again. Outside, more people gathered. They didn't know the details, only that something serious was happening inside Wells' restaurant. Men leaned against street lamps. Women paused mid-conversation. Everyone sensed history hovering close. The mobster straightened his jacket, tried to reclaim control. He reminded himself who he worked for. Powerful names, powerful families, men who had ruled New York's underworld for decades. He believed that alone should be enough to bend Bumpy Johnson. But Harlem didn't bend easily. Bumpy finally spoke again, his voice low and steady. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Every word landed exactly where it was meant to. The mobster leaned in without realizing it, drawn by the calm authority in Bumpy's tone. Even the 6 men behind him seemed to pause, as if instinct told them this was a moment to listen, not act. The air felt charged now, like a storm building without thunder. One wrong word, one wrong movement, and everything could explode. Guns were still there. Danger was still real. But so was something else. Control. Bumpy's wife watched closely, her expression unreadable. She knew whatever was said next would echo far beyond that room. It would reach the Mafia bosses downtown. It would reach the streets of Harlem. It would decide whether peace survived or shattered. The mobster swallowed, his confidence slipping just enough to be noticed. He hadn't expected to feel cornered in a place where he brought the weapons. He hadn't expected a calm man with no visible protection to hold the room hostage with nothing but presence. Time stretched. Seconds felt long. No one moved. No one breathed too loud. And as Bumpy prepared to finish what he had started, everyone understood they were standing at the edge of something irreversible. The next word spoken would either light the fuse for war or end the Mafia's ambitions in Harlem forever. Bumpy finally broke the silence. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It moved through the room the way authority does when it's unquestioned. He spoke slowly, making sure every word had space to land. He reminded the mobster where he was standing. Not just a restaurant, not just Harlem, but a place built on loyalty, where people remember who protected them when no one else would. The mobster tried to interrupt, but Bumpy lifted one finger, not aggressive, just firm. The room froze again. That small gesture carried more weight than the guns in the room. Bumpy looked around, not at his people for support, but as if he was reminding the mobster of something obvious, that none of this belonged to him. Then Bumpy turned back and said the 6 words. They weren't shouted. They weren't dramatic. They were calm, almost quiet, but the meaning behind them hit like a door slamming shut. The kind of words that don't threaten, they state facts. The kind of words that tell you your future has already been decided, and there's nothing you can do to change it. The mobster's face drained of color. For a split second, it looked like he might react, like fear might turn into desperation. One of his men tightened his grip. Another took half a step forward and stopped. Everyone in the room understood how close they were to chaos. But chaos never came. The mobster slowly raised his hand, signaling his crew to stay still. His eyes never left Bumpy. In that moment, he wasn't looking at a rival. He was looking at a man who controlled an entire city without needing to announce it. A man who didn't need approval from mafia families or crime bosses downtown. The mobster swallowed and did something no one expected. He apologized. Not loudly, not proudly, just enough to be heard, enough to be real, enough to save himself. The air shifted instantly. Guns stayed holstered. Shoulders relaxed, just a little. The storm that had been building didn't break. It passed. The mobster backed away slowly, careful not to turn his back too fast. His crew followed, eyes still scanning the room, but their confidence was gone. When the door finally closed behind them, it felt like the building exhaled. No cheering, no celebrating, just quiet respect. Bumpy sat back down, picked up his fork, and continued his meal as if nothing extraordinary had happened. That was the message. This was normal. This was how things worked in Harlem. But the real impact didn't come until later. That same night, word reached Manhattan, then Brooklyn, then Queens. By morning, the story had spread through every corner of New York's underworld. Not exaggerated, not softened, just told exactly as it happened. Emergency meetings were called, names were mentioned, risks were weighed, and then came the decision. Harlem would be left alone, not because the mafia couldn't fight, not because they were afraid of one man, but because they understood something they'd ignored for too long. You can't take territory where the people stand with their leader. You can't occupy loyalty. That should have been the end of it. But here's the twist no one saw coming. Weeks later, Bumpy received a message through quiet channels. Not a threat, not an apology, an offer. The mafia didn't want Harlem anymore. They wanted partnership. Respect had replaced force. Negotiation replaced pressure. Bumpy declined. He didn't need their approval. And he didn't want their shadow hanging over his people. Years later, the mobster who walked into Wells' restaurant that night faded from the spotlight. Some said he moved on. Others said he was quietly pushed aside for making the wrong call in Harlem. No one ever confirmed which story was true. But one thing was certain. After that night, no mafia crew ever walked into Harlem without permission again. And the 6 words Bumpy Johnson spoke that evening became legend. Not because they were loud or cruel, but because they proved something timeless. Real power doesn't demand respect. It earns it. The days after that night passed quietly on the surface, but underneath Harlem, everything felt different. People walked the streets with a little more confidence. Shop owners opened their doors a little earlier. Numbers runners did their routes without looking over their shoulders as much. Nothing had changed officially. Yet everyone knew something important had happened inside Wells' restaurant. Bumpy Johnson didn't make speeches about it. He didn't spread the story himself. He didn't need to. Harlem had its own way of remembering. Stories traveled through barbershops, church steps, back rooms, and late-night conversations. Each version sounded slightly different, but the meaning stayed the same. Harlem had been tested, and it had held. For Bumpy, life went on as usual. He still sat in the same booth, still watched the doors, still handled problems quietly. The numbers game kept running, not just as business, but as a system people relied on. Rent got paid, kids stayed in school, families stayed afloat. That was always the point. Even when outsiders pretended it was only about money, the mafia kept its distance. There were no more surprise visits, no more pressure plays. When business crossed paths with Harlem, it came through respectful channels. Conversations replaced threats. Agreements replaced force. Power had shifted without a single shot being fired. Some wondered why Bumpy didn't take advantage of the moment to expand, to push further, to grab more territory. But that wasn't his way. He understood something many powerful men never did. Control isn't about how much you take. It's about knowing where to stop. His wife remained his quiet anchor through it all. She understood the weight he carried, the risks that never disappeared completely. That night in the restaurant stayed with her, not because of fear, but because of what it proved. That dignity, once defended, becomes untouchable. As time passed, the mobster who had walked into Harlem that night became a cautionary tale. Not because he was weak, but because he misunderstood where real strength came from. He had believed power lived in guns, titles, and names whispered in dark rooms. Harlem taught him otherwise. Years later, when people spoke about Bumpy Johnson, they didn't just talk about crime or money. They talked about presence, about how a man could control a room without raising his voice, about how leadership could look calm instead of cruel, about how loyalty, once earned, could stand against any outside force. The city changed. Harlem changed. The world moved forward. But the lesson from that night never faded. Respect isn't something you take. The moment you try, you lose it. Bumpy Johnson understood that better than anyone. That's why Harlem stood with him. That's why outsiders learned to tread carefully. And that's why one quiet moment in a small restaurant became part of New York's underground history. Not because of violence, but because of restraint. And long after the music stopped playing and the smoke cleared, people still remember how Harlem chose its king. Not through fear, but through trust.